Welcome to the Autonomic Healing Podcast. I'm Tom Pells.
And I'm Ruth Lawrenson. We'll be unpacking what it looks like to activate your brain to holistically manage stress and trauma that bring healing to the mind, body, and spirit.
Being free to live authentically as humans.
Thank you for joining us. Let's get this conversation started.
So, Tom, we're going to speak about perceptions. And really this episode, we want to kind of dive into the dynamics of them. There are actually 4. If you could just start us out in terms of, last episode, we looked at, like why it's so important
the
for
dangers.
us. Yeah, because there's dangers.
Possibilities.
Absolutely.
And things like that. Yes.
But let's get to the nitty gritty of why are the perceptions the way they are? Why do they, it's not so much why they matter, but why do they exist?
Many years ago, many years ago, and even as when I was in high school, and they had the aptitude very early on, because this was decades and decades and decades ago, but there was these aptitude tests, and you could take these tests and they would show you what your basic interests were, even if you didn't know, which is fascinating to me. And the 2 highest ones that showed up for me were theology and psychology, which is why I went to get my bachelor's degree in music.
Yes, of course. Makes perfect logical sense.
It does, because that's what I was really good at, and I was just going to do something that I was really good at, not what I really wanted to do. Just because I was really good at something and had a great singing voice and could conduct doesn't mean I should have gotten a bachelor's degree in it, but that's what I was encouraged to do, and I wasn't encouraged to go into psychology or theology, both ironically of which I eventually did and got master's degrees in both. But my point is that my first graduate degree was a Master of Divinity. And how do I say this? Thousands of years ago, Paul, the apostle, wrote a bunch of letters to different groups of people. And one of them that he wrote was to a group of people that were in Rome. And in that, right at the very beginning of it, Paul wrote that thinking they were wise, they became fools. And this was since the beginning of creation. So the context is that way back with Adam and Eve and that story, people thought they were wise, but they became fools. And thinking they were wise, and although they claimed to be wise, their thinking was futile. And futile is a Greek word that means, interestingly, vain and sort of an unhealthy self-focus, but also unproductive. It just doesn't make any sense. And it's not beneficial. It's unproductive. So thinking they were wise, they became fools. And although they claimed to be wise, their thinking was futile. And while that occurs in the Bible, which is a part of the Christian religion, it's just a fundamental description of human beings. We think we're wise. That's a great idea. Uh-oh. No, it's not. But it makes sense, except it doesn't make sense. It's nonsense.
So there's even there, it's that scripture is alluding to the way that we think, these patterns that we think are futile.
That seem wise to us, except they aren't. And back in the Genesis, which is thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago in age, the story, there's Adam and Eve, and the temptation was to eat from something that God said would kill them because it would make them wise. And they thought eating something that would kill them and disrupt intimacy in a relationship was a good idea. And thinking they were wise, they became fools. And that's the story of human beings and humanity. So I understood that. Paul also wrote that later in the same letter, he said, don't conform to the pattern of this world. Instead, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. This is theology and psychology.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting that he even used the word patterns.
Yes.
Because this is what, when we talk about perceptions,
Yes.
that you've kind of written out these perceptions, they're from patterns that you've observed over years and years and years as a pastor, but then obviously as a psychologist as well. You've observed psychotherapist.
I don't have a doctorate.
Okay. But thank you for that clarification. But you've observed those patterns.
Mm-hmm.
So I just think that's where they came from for you. And then in the scripture that Paul's talking about, can you say that again?
Yes. Don't conform to the pattern of this world.
So he's saying in that
There's a pattern. And that's the tsunami of stress. So backing up, where did all this stuff come from? The pattern of this world. Don't conform to the pattern of this world. Instead, in other words, alternatively, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. The only conclusion I could come to is that the pattern of this world must be a pattern of thinking. And what is the most fundamental dynamics in terms of the human neuroscience and the brain function is that in the autonomic nervous system, that there is flight or fight, sympathetic, relax, recover, rest, digest, and then the enteric nervous system is the part of the brain that's in the gut. But all of that influenced by, from the top down, the prefrontal cortex. So the cortex, the back part of the cortex is sensory processing. You take in sensory information. And I'm not talking about seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, and smelling only, as those 21 senses, including interoception, which is another podcast earlier. But then the front part of the cortex is executive function. Captain of this body and sailing the ship into an iceberg. And anticipation. What do I think is going to happen? And how often we have a negative anticipation. And why have a negative anticipation, but only because we're not actually thinking rationally and realistically about what's occurring. Personality expression. That's a function of the prefrontal cortex. Decision-making and problem-solving. Well, all of that triggered by sensing or perceiving a threat to well-being based on what? The way we think and past experiences, which influenced the way we think. So we see and we have a tendency to sense or perceive threat where it doesn't actually even exist. Why? Because it once did. It's like the Vietnam War vet who was having panic attacks looking at my desk lamp because he'd been in a bunker and a rocket had hit it and the yellow flash and the concussive force. He's seeing a yellow light. He's thinking, he's sensing my desk lamp as a threat to his well-being. It was a desk lamp. Yeah. It wasn't going to hurt me. But he was reactive to it because of that unresolved stress. We have perceptions that do the same thing. And somebody has some nonverbal communication or tone of voice or something occurs or we anticipate something is going to be negative or rejection or whatever, and we lose our minds because we perceive a threat where it doesn't actually exist. Thinking they were wise, they became fools. And it makes sense to us, but it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and I think that there's
a pattern to that.
Yeah, there's this, and I actually think that verse is so powerful. The do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, because it really is talking about what we're talking about, which is that there are patterns that we have, patterns of perceptions that we have that, and we talked about this in the last episode, that seem rational, but they're not actually real. But they're transforming, which is what I love actually, Tom, about what we do with the perceptions in AHA, because it just doesn't stop with, and we were joking about this earlier, it doesn't stop with like, hey, guess what? you've got like these terrible patterns of perception and then leave you there. It's like there's this transforming into the renewing of our minds, into the renewing of the way we can see things.
Yep.
So do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when I was looking at the pattern of this world, what is that pattern? Well, if it's not actually rational, then it must seem rational but not actually be rational. And it is reactive to some sensed or perceived threat to well-being. Well, that's what the tsunami of stress is. It's a reactivity that begins with flee the threat.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can't flee the threat, then fight the threat. And if I can't fight the threat, then back to flee.
Yeah.
And then fight. And it's just this escalating pattern, but the dynamics keep changing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the same basic pattern. And I am a very keen observer of things. I notice stuff. And what I observed, and this goes back into when I was doing counseling and in ministry, or when I was working in psychotherapy, I observed the same kind of thoughts and ideas that kept recurring.
So this is interesting because this is the history really as to how you've come up with this. It's a personality theory, the perceptions that we use in AHA. Mm-hmm. But it came from
observation.
Just hours and hours and hours
sitting with people as they were talking.
So literally you would kind of say, well, okay, what's up? You know, what are we talking about today? And they would start talking. You'd see the patterns in just what they were saying. Yeah.
Expressed in different details, but they were the same basic perceptions, like perfectionism or people-pleasing or criticism or control and directing people in situations or avoiding and isolating and cutting corners and taking the easy way out. These are basic manifestations of people's perceptions. And they were, because the conversation would be, so what's the therapeutic issue? What are you struggling with? That's essentially about what are you sensing or perceiving threat in your life about? And you can't figure it out, and it keeps going sideways and getting worse and worse and worse. All that said to me was, these are perceptions that they're having of themselves, others, and situations. And I used to jokingly say, if you take the first letter of self, others, and situations, you've got SOS. And help! And that's triggering a sense threat.
So
save our souls.
So let me just back up a little bit. So through just all, so many years of therapy and being with people in these spaces, you observed these perceptions. So how many of them are there in AHA?
A dozen or so. They're distinctly, there are endless variations on them.
So the only reason I say that is that these actually came from the observing. One of the things I really think has been very valuable to me, I know, is that the language that you put to them feels like so easy to get hold of. But really they are just like you say, control or perfectionism or
people pleasing or
they're not new at all. They're just you're just seeing, oh, okay, these are some of the main ones that I'm seeing in the office.
Seeing them recurring over and over and over. And I kept observing that they kept occurring in a distinctive pattern.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because one thing that, someone who's going through AHA after the somatic, if they go to the problem solving,
the cognitive,
that's where they will engage with their perceptions. And basically they kind of find their four, right? So I'm curious as to why there's four.
Okay.
So talk to me about that a little bit.
So what I observed, and this is all observational, I didn't think, wouldn't it be cool if, and creative that way. I in our earlier conversation before we started recording, I mentioned if I was a painter, I would not be an impressionist. I would be a photorealist. This is what I'm seeing, and I'm painting what I see as accurately and realistically as I possibly can, like it's a photograph, except I'm painting it. I'm just painting what I see. I wouldn't be the impressionist and abstract art. That wouldn't be me. So that analogy is I was just describing what I was observing. And what I was observing is that when people would start describing what their issue was, that it would start with a perception. Then there would be a second perception reactive to the first, or an extension of the first, and then a third one would carry that on, and then there would be a fourth one. And I noticed that when they got to their fifth statement, it'd be the same thing as the first one dynamically. And then the fifth one, or the sixth one, was the same as the second one and the third.
Yeah.
And it just, I kept seeing the same basic
patterns.
4 perceptions over and over and over and over again. And they just kept occurring like that. And then I noticed, well, that's the same as this tsunami, this escalating pattern of stress and need, flee, distress and discontent, fight, avoidance and isolation, flee, resistance, defiance, anger, and aggression, a literal fight, just the need to feel good, flee. And it just kept following the same pattern. But I also noticed then that since that seemed rational to them, that made sense to them, which was why they couldn't figure out the problem, that as the therapist who could be more objective about it, I'd say, but that's actually the solution, is this actually rational perception. So like, rather than people pleasing, being loving, and rather than perfectionism and getting it right, learning. And
so that's the transformation.
Then I noticed had its own pattern, and that's rational intimacy.
So I remember you saying that back in the day you'd just literally have a drawer full of like highlighter pens, right?
I did.
This is where it came from, guys.
Yeah,
so
I would literally write out verbatim what the person was saying to me.
Yeah.
And the reason I did that was because way back in the day with my first master's degree, and I was in my internship in a cancer ward in a hospital, and the chaplain taught us to do verbatims. We would literally have to recreate verbatim as best we could what the person said to us. And so I learned how to do that. Which was really challenging when it was a 45-minute or an hour conversation, and recreating that verbatim as best I could. So I just learned to just take, this is what the person's saying, this is the pattern of it, and I just kept observing the pattern. And then as I observed the pattern, I wanted in my own mind to rather than trying to keep track of all that in my mind, I just used highlighters. And I had 4 different color highlighters, and I would highlight the first one, and then I'd highlight the second thought, and then highlight the third thought, and highlight the fourth thought, 4 different highlighters and colors. And then I noticed, oh, wait a minute, this next one, that's the same as the first one. Yeah. And it was just this very colorful pattern of 4. And then I started putting them together with these basic perceptions, misperceptions and myth perceptions, and it matched the tsunami. And then the actually rational emerged as well.
That's amazing. And so what happens in autonomic healing activation is that we do engage with our perceptions. We find our 4. Like you said, there's like a dozen or so. And they are... There's this pattern in the way we perceive things that follows the tsunami of stress, and they're unique to us because we have our own 4. So talk to me a little bit about how, because not only are there 4, which to me is fascinating, just that, and the fact that they follow the 4 stages of the tsunami of stress, that for me is fascinating. But within the 4, there's these kind of pairing. There's there's a dynamic. Yeah. So talk about that.
So as I observed this pattern of 4, just kept repeating. I began to wonder, why is it occurring that way? And then I observed that there were dynamics that were happening between the 4, that the first one and the second one were dynamically created, there was a dynamic.
Duo. They were almost like connected, yeah.
Yeah. And what ultimately it all emerged into was observing that the first one and the second one, the first one is a fundamental, a primary way of thinking about self, others, and situations that's not actually rational. And then the second one was a fallback to that. It's like, this is the ideal, but that's not going to happen. So here's my fallback to that. Mm-hmm. And then the third one was back to another, wouldn't it be nice if? And the fourth was, oh crap, this is the way it really is. And so I noticed that they were related that way. So the first and the second and the third and fourth formed together. Mm-hmm. But then I noticed, well, wait a minute. The first one and the third one are paired too, because that's sort of the idealized situation,
so it's like the persona.
Relationship, dynamics. It's like the persona. It's the mask that we wear.
It's like what we want.
Yes.
It's like, so the first and the third perceptions that we have are like, I love that, the mask we wear, the persona that we project.
Yep.
And then so they're a pair.
Because that way we can avoid the threat. Flee.
And then, so then the second and fourth
are when the mask slips. And that's the dark, like Jung would say, the shadow. Okay. But that's the dark side. That's when the mask slips, and it's not the idealized, wouldn't it be nice if, and the fairy tale. Mm-hmm. It's the dark reality that we think is the way things actually are, but fear and resist and don't like that. Mm-hmm. And so the second and fourth ones are when the mask slips.
Wow.
And it is this constant trying to keep the mask on, but something happens or somebody does something, it slips off, and yeah.
So we have so let me just recap. So we have 4 perceptions, and they mirror the tsunami of stress.
Yep.
And then within the dynamics within them is there's 2 pairings. Mm-hmm. There's the pairing which is one with the fallback of the second, and the third with the fallback of the fourth. Mm-hmm. And then there's this second pairing which is 1 and 3 are like the persona, the mask that we want to be. Yep. And then 2 and 4 are what happens when the mask falls, the dark side,
what
the shadow
we really
side.
Believe is the case. Because the seemingly rational nature of them isn't actually rational, none of it is the way things actually are.
Mm. And what's crazy here, and talk about the highlighter pens, but in the sachet, I mean, you don't use the highlighter pens anymore because we've got computers and all the rest of it, but you still use colours, and you still a part of the therapy is writing down everything that comes out, right?
Yeah. So then I had that all down and seeing all that before I created AHA, before I found a way to facilitate and activate homeostasis. And after I'd figured out how to do the somatic homeostasis, I wondered if it was possible to activate the cognitive homeostasis. This is the problem solving. This is an episode in season 1 about AHA problem solving. But what I discovered is that the brain itself is actually rational. And here's the difference. The brain is an organ in the body. The mind is us using that organ in the body. It's kind of like the difference between my computer and me as the user of my computer. I can use that in an actually rational way, or I can get completely irrational with that, and then the computer's locking up and going, what commands are you putting into me? This doesn't make any sense and I can't work. Well, that's a user error, not a problem in the system. Back to our last episode in Sydney.
Back to Sydney.
Yes, and her dark side. And all that.
And just in case anyone hasn't listened to the last episode, we just talked a little bit about Sydney.
Artificial
intelligence and how the intelligence, ironically, has been based on our broken patterns
of perceptions and modeling. And
that was last episode, so you can go back.
And
anyway.
We've just traumatized poor Sydney, the artificial intelligence, with our own irrationality, which is not intelligent at all. Anyway, so what I then noticed is that those four, with the two pairings, the first and second and the third and fourth, were manifesting two basic dynamics in us as human beings: relationship and performance. And one pair was all about relationship and sort of the mask we would wear and when the mask would slip relationally. And the other was performance and how we would keep the mask on for performance, and then the mask would slip and it would get into that dark side of the performance. And it just fit.
That's really interesting.
It described what I was observing.
So, and then with the personality and performance, that will be tailored to the individual.
Yep,
so it's not
it's bespoke.
Yeah.
Because each one of those four is unique to me. I have my pattern. Now, other people may have that pattern too, but I don't necessarily have your pattern. And so those are potentially fit, or they potentially fundamentally clash.
Yeah. So I just want to go back to something you were talking about, because I think this is really important. Because you were doing the perceptions, before you discovered AHA.
Yes.
So what you said was you were talking about the computer and the user, and so with our mind, which is why talk therapy is I guess more using our mind. Would you say, is that right?
It's your mind interacting with the mind of the therapist, who is hopefully rational or at least more objective than you are.
So, but what you said was you discovered that the brain was actually rational.
Yes.
And this is the like pivotal point here, because suddenly what we've got here is not just well, that's really interesting, because, like there are lots of personality theories out there, which are awesome. And there's some, there's a similarity here to this, but you've observed the patterns, you've observed the pairings. But when you're talking about homeostasis, when we can activate homeostasis and activate the brain, and when we've always joked that the brain is the therapist, hashtag, yes. But the brain suddenly becomes the therapist, and you allow the brain, as we're in homeostasis, to be the therapist. Then you start getting into the actual rational. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's where AHA became aha.
An aha moment.
Yes, and I've had people say, so did you create the name AHA to reflect that? No, that's just a curious circumstance that occurred because the autonomic nervous system, healing, because most people didn't know what the word homeostasis meant, and activation. You're just initiating it. But we have aha moments. It's where we, as the user of our brain, have been trying to figure something out, and we can't, or we're trying to remember something and we're unable to, and then we stop using the brain for that purpose, we go on to something else, but the brain continues to do the thinking, and then it brings what the brain thought at a subconscious level into conscious awareness, and we have aha, I know what I could do, or I remember now. And that's the brain thinking. Mm-hmm. And it's actually rational. It makes sense of the nonsense, as one client put it in my mind. And
it also allows us it brings us into our actual rational perceptions.
Yes.
So what happens in...
which is what I observed.
Yeah, so... yes.
It was doing. It's like, that's actually rational.
So what
and the brain's coming up with it and just informing the person's conscious mind.
Because not only do we have these 4 seemingly rational perceptions that have their own dynamics, and they follow the pattern of the tsunami of stress, and then they've got these pairings within it. And if you just talk about a problem and wrote it all down, the likelihood is that you would see that pattern, like verbatim.
Yep.
But what happens in autonomic healing activation, when we activate homeostasis, is that we allow the brain to take us from that, which is the patterns of the mind.
Rational tsunami of stress.
It takes us right into and swings into our 4 actual rational, because we actually have 4 actually rational
alternative perceptions.
They're I guess
it's the way the brain thinks, because the brain deals with things for what they are, unless it hasn't had a chance to be able to normalize that.
Which, going back to what the Apostle Paul was writing about, is the transforming.
Be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And that word renewing is the Greek word metamorphosis. Mm-hmm. We're crawling around like these little caterpillars, and then we get cocooned, and all sorts of well-being and change occurs, and then we climb out of that cocoon, and then we fly. Mm-hmm. And that's the metamorphosis. Be transformed by the renewing of the mind. It's these changed perceptions, renewed perceptions.
And that's
they shift from seemingly rational to actually rational.
Yeah. And so there's this journeying, there's this renewing, there's this becoming who we're meant to be with our 4 actually rational alternatives.
Yes.
And I think that's really important, because it isn't just, like we said earlier on, it isn't just kind of identifying the broken way which we see things, actually understanding there's a transformation that's available here.
Which is the point.
And actually, when we activate our brain, go into homeostasis, we can... and what I find fascinating, Tom, is that, I've been around long enough now to see how it works. But what happens, what tends to happen in a session is, you start with a problem and activate, and then you start talking and sharing and all the rest of it, and it starts. You can see the swing, because it starts with the seemingly rational,
because it's saying, okay, here's your problem. Yeah, this is the problem, and then it swings and shifts,
and by the end of it,
here's your solution.
We're in the actual rational,
but the brain does it.
Yes,
and we, with our minds, can simply observe it, and because it's our own brains. That's us. And we did it, but we had our brain help us to understand it in an actually rational way. And it happens every single time. Mm-hmm.
It does.
It's weird.
There you go. You said the word weird too.
Yes, and then we can affirm that. We can choose that. Mm-hmm. We
and
didn't have that choice before, but now we do have that choice.
And I think, the more and more you access that space, the more you activate homeostasis and ask your brain to solve a problem and to see the swinging, because we all have these seemingly rational perceptions, but you swing back, the more you end up living in that space, which is a rational intimacy. Yep. So that's fascinating. So anyway, brilliant stuff, Tom. Thank you for sharing. I'm sure we'll kind of be dipping in and out of that, but hopefully that's clear, because it's just a bit of the history of how you've come up with this, and like why these perceptions exist and the dynamics that exist within them. So hopefully that's given our listeners some handles on what's to come, really, because we're going to launch into going through the perceptions one by one. It's going to be fun, and then talk about their actual rational alternative too.
Yes,
which is awesome. So thanks for this conversation, and we'll see you next time around.
You've been listening to the Autonomic Healing Podcast.
Join us next time as we continue in our conversations with Tom. If you're interested in pursuing your own autonomic healing journey and want to find a practitioner, visit our website, innerworkings.org. See you at the next episode.